I'm your chair for today. I'm a director for Secure Limited, which is a consultancy and technical service provider to the food industry. I've worked in food safety and technology for over 25 years, covering a whole range of product categories, product development, private label programs, technical support and consultancy. And I've worked in the egg packing sites in both the UK, Ireland and Italy to ensure retail and manufacturing standards and protocols are established. I'm proud to be a fellow of the IFST. I'm also a member of the IFST Food Safety Group. The IFST Food Safety Group decided to run this egg webinar to highlight the importance of egg safety and the controls that we have as an industry. So many people take for granted the Lion scheme and that our eggs are safe to eat, with little acknowledgement of where we've come from as an industry and also of the great work that continues. Today, as part of this webinar, we will look at some of the issues that have been associated with eggs in the past and some of the subsequent innovative food technological solutions to ensure that safety, quality and provenance of this important and much loved food. We will look at schemes such as the British Lion Mark, which ensure that eggs and egg products have been produced to the highest standards of food safety, which covers all systems and stages of production and is the scheme that has effectively eradicated Salmonella from the UK eggs since the launch in 1998. We will look at this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded onto the IFST webinar hub. Feel free to make comments and ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. This can also be used in the case of any technical difficulties. If you see questions that you like, you can upvote these questions by clicking the like button next to these questions to ensure that we then can ask these questions to our panel. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation where we will respond to as many of these questions as possible, so please make sure you put them through the Q&A section. Our speakers today are Sterling Crew and Kevin Coles. Sterling is an experienced food and public health sector director. He is the chair of the advisory board for the Food Authenticity Network of the Laboratory of the Government Chemist. He is co-founder of Kitchen Conversation, managing director of SQS Limited, and is a strategic advisor at the Dynamic Risk Indicator and Shield Safety Group. Sterling is also a scientific advisor at Camden BRI and sits on its board. He is also on the Audit Governance Board at Eurofins and a trustee of CIEH. In his spare time, if he has any, Sterling also chairs the Institute of Food Science and Technology's Food Safety Group and is the immediate past vice president. He has over 40 years experience working in the field of national and international food safety, governance, communication, sustainability and regulation. And last but by no means least, Sterling is the independent food scientific advisor to the British Lion Mark. So we are delighted that he is able to share and impart his knowledge with us today. Kevin is the trade director at British Egg Information Service. Kevin started working for the British Egg Information Service back in 1999 as the British Lion Quality Code of Practice was introduced. Over the past 20 or so years, he has worked with many organisations highlighting the benefits of the British Lion Mark as it became the leading quality standard in the UK and is represented on more than 90% of British eggs. For more information on our speakers today, please see their biographies on the IFST website. Sterling will be presenting for us today, and then Kevin will be joining us after Sterling's presentation to join us for the Q&A sessions. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Sterling.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Jude, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. As Jude has said, we're going to be talking about eggs, and the reason I'm going to be talking about eggs is because, as Jude intimated, they're a great success story when it comes to food scientists and for industry addressing a problem. So on the menu today, which we'll try to canter through so you have as much opportunity as you can to answer any questions, we're going to be looking at some of the hazards that have been associated with eggs. And we were looking globally as well as just the UK. And you can imagine what they are. It's the problems with Salmonella, some of the chemical issues that have arisen. And then also looking about how the way eggs fit into food safety management systems in catering and food service and manufacturing. We've mentioned quality, so we're going to be talking a bit about quality and about provenance as well, food fraud, why that is so important to us. So our first hazard, Salmonella, which will be as no surprise to anyone. I mean, Salmonella is a terrible, terrible disease. It affects 157 million people in the world every year, and there are something like 57,000 deaths from salmonellosis. And in this country, we still have Salmonella. It's something we're very familiar with in the food industry. We're always fighting to reduce salmonellosis. We know it can be very unpleasant as well as causing death. And we know that where we find it is in animals, it's a zoonosis. You'll find it in the environment. You find it in poultry and pigs and cattle. You'll find it in your pets. If you keep turtles, they have a high level of Salmonella. And we find it obviously in birds as well, which is what we're going to be talking today with eggs. And this is talking about something that really affected us in the 1980s, the Salmonella challenge. I'll reflect back on the 1980s. I just qualified as an environmental health practitioner. And the 1980s for food safety was a bit like you see climate change today. So you've seen with COP26, the media's covered with it. Public are really concerned quite rightly. Every newspaper has it. And 1988 was like that for food safety. Everything you used to eat was going to do you some harm. We had BSE, we had the Salmonella in eggs, we had Listeria monocytogenes appearing in soft cheeses and chilled foods. We had after some of our wine from Austria had antifreeze in it. I mean, it used to be just every day you were being battered from post to pillar. And we didn't have the FSA in those days, so we didn't have somebody that would stand up and could give an authoritative view. And this is when the junior minister for health, Edwina Curry, made her famous statement about the flocks being infected, the eggs, not the flocks, being infected with Salmonella. And the impact on the industry was huge. The whole industry collapsed, flocks were killed, eggs were disposed of. And I think this is a great story about how an industry got together to address a problem and then connect with consumers to show them what they're doing. So it is one of the, out of the kind of ashes of the egg industry, a phoenix arose, which actually is stronger, better, and gives a little more confidence than you'll probably find anywhere else in the world now. So we know that there are vertical and horizontal ways that Salmonella gets into eggs. You can get it horizontally, where actually it penetrates the egg shell. So if you keep eggs in very poor conditions, it can get through that way. And then the other way, which is the biggest concern, is it actually can infect the ovary, and the shell can form around the ovary if the actual bird has Salmonella and be actually in the shell that way. So we have two routes of transmission. And what that means is that even if eggs are boiled in their shells, there could still be some contamination inside the shell unless it reaches 75 degrees C. So obviously there was a problem there that if you had Salmonella in an egg and you didn't cook it thoroughly, then you could have problems with perhaps carryover. And remember, this is a global problem. And some of the deaths I highlighted are from eggs where people are still eating eggs globally that are not from Salmonella-free flocks like we have here as a consequence of this. And the Department of Health at the time, because there was no Food Standards Agency, started to say things. The government started to say that you shouldn't be eating eggs if you belong to a vulnerable group. So if you're old, or if you're young, if you're pregnant, if you have some other compromise condition, you should be avoiding having runny eggs. And you have to cook them thoroughly. So if you're having a fried egg, make sure you cook it right to the core, and boiled eggs should be hard. And as you can imagine, once all this advice came out, how the consumers reacted, I saw a massive drop-off in egg sales due to confidence issues. So then I thought was one of the most remarkable things, which is the a response from the egg industry, which was the formation of the Lying Code of Practice. And it was a huge investment to do this. And I think you couldn't switch this on overnight. You had to get the evidence, the scientific evidence. You had to engage with stakeholders. So even though this happened in 1988, it was 1998 when actually the Code of Practice came out. There were a lot of steps being taken before those, but to make sure that it was done correctly and it was going to last and it was going to give consumer confidence, it did take a while actually to develop. I left local government where I was an EHO, trying to deal with the eggs and consumers, trying to convince them what to do. And I actually moved to Marks and Spencer in 2000. And then I saw it from a retailer's perspective, how much work Marks and Spencer were doing independently, along with other retailers, to ensure that this problem was addressed. So it's a huge issue for the whole industry, right from the actual hatcheries right down to the shelf. So it was a total supply chain overhaul. And I would recommend that you use the code. Rather than going into too much detail, as Jude says, that we have a paper coming out in the IFST journal, and it will give you some more of the information behind it. We're up to code issue 7, and there's a new one coming out in January. But I thought the most important essence of this code is that all line eggs are guaranteed British. So you know where they're coming when they come from their provenance, and that the flocks are vaccinated against Salmonella. And this is so, so critical for this particular hazard. So you're vaccinating flocks, and it starts right up at the breeding stage when you're actually developing the strains of chicken that you're going to use to look at the eggs. It goes through to hatcheries. So the whole national flock that is covered by this scheme has been vaccinated against Salmonella. And the scheme has been independently audited so that you can have confidence that it works. Some other person has said it works, not just industry and the egg industry. It's got a great registration scheme, and what I like is a unique passport system for traceability. So that traceability element, as we know, is really important, not just for the hens, not just for the eggs, but also for the feed. And that traceability gives you confidence, as we all know, in food safety and indeed in provenance as well. The eggs are stamped, so you will be familiar with the stamp, and this happens on the farm. So again, this is great for traceability and fights any fraudsters that might be operating in the marketplace. You know, you've seen the eggs, they have a best before date, which is 28 days after lay, and you have that quality mark to give you assurance about the quality systems. I think, especially when you start to see some of the other cases we'll talk about, like chemical contamination, it's really important to have stringent feed controls in there as well. And the scheme really covers that in some detail. And the increased hygiene controls that you see above legislation on farms, especially on biosecurity, which are quite strict. And as we saw last week, we've seen avian flu emerge in North Wales and a number of farms. And this biodiversity is so important for the industry. And there's regular egg testing above what the government requires. And to supplement that, you have a cool chain starting right at the farm. And the success of the code is demonstrable. We've seen it with the dramatic reductions in cases of Salmonella associated with British line eggs and eggs generally. And if you look at the data, which again is in the paper, you can see how certain interventions over the years have had this dramatic decrease in Salmonella being found in eggs. And so I say, it's got Food Standards Agency on the slide here, but in fact, this was the Department of Health. Following Edwina Curry's comments, people were concerned about the amount of Salmonella, although her description wasn't exactly correct. She misspoke in a way, and perhaps using a different phraseology might have been more accurate. But we were saying things like elderly people, babies, toddlers, and pregnant women, should be really careful. And I think it's not just vulnerable groups. When I was in public health, I used to meet people who had Salmonella. I've seen very young, fit people being completely laid out, really serious, going into intensive care. And I've seen old pensioners who are asymptomatic, didn't even know they had it, and they've been picked up on a blood test. So it's not just, I think, vulnerable people obviously are more likely to have serious symptoms, but anyone that gets Salmonella is a very, very unpleasant disease. So there was a risk assessment carried out by the Advisory Committee on Microbiological Safety of the FSA in 2016, and they said that the risk from undercooked lion eggs was now very, very low. And in fact, in 2014, EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, also came out with a similar view that British lion eggs were the best in the world and had very, very low levels of Salmonella. And that led to an amazing announcement, which is where the FSA gave advice that it's safe for infants and children and pregnant women now to eat raw eggs or underly lightly cooked eggs. And I think that kind of was the big statement that from the disaster of 1988, how the industry has managed to completely turn it around with a lot of great engagement, a lot of good science, and also more importantly, engagement with the consumers. And as a consequence of that, we've seen egg growth year on year, and it is a national favorite food. It's a very important part of a healthy diet, and we've seen sales grow and the industry recover on the back of good science and this commitment to dealing with a crisis. And then there's a question about just British legs. Are there any other schemes at the moment? So the FSA can approve any other scheme, but this is the biggest scheme that is out there. 90% of egg production now is actually covered by the British Lion scheme. And it is the envy, I think, of most other countries who don't have this type of system. So I don't know if you're in Brazil, if you're in America, if you're in China, you don't have this type of system. And so food scientists and the industry are using other methods to try to avoid salmonellosis from eggs and egg products, using other things like controlling the cleanliness and also ensuring that the cold chain's in place. But as I say, this is not a guarantee that the egg is salmonella free. There are just potential ways you can decrease the likelihood. And we've seen this in non-UK eggs. So the scheme here, as I say, is I think the envy of the world. And we do see these outbreaks are still happening globally. As Jude said, we just take it for granted now in this country that eggs are safe, but that's not happening elsewhere. And we've seen cases of salmonella tainted eggs in different places, and we're still seeing deaths within Europe, recorded deaths, and as far afield as Israel as well. We've seen problems with infection in flocks. And so, and the other thing is we're talking about microbiological hazard, but we have chemical hazards as well. Not so long ago, 2017, there was the fipronil scandal, which happened on Dutch egg production. And fipronil, as you know, is a wide-ranging insecticide. It's used against red mites that you get in poultry, but it is illegal for it to get into eggs. And so you have to be careful that you don't have any egg contamination. There was an issue in Europe. There were millions of eggs taken off the shelves. It was a huge recall. About 700,000 eggs got into this country from Holland, but in fact they weren't egg in shells. They were used for products. So the recalls in this country related to sandwiches and chilled food where the egg product got in there rather than from on shell. The Food Standards Agency, as you know, at the time gave the information that due to the levels and the amount of contamination, they thought there was no immediate risk to health, but obviously it was illegal. And it should be taken off the shelves. So the fipronil scandal had a big effect upon egg confidence again in Europe, which is constantly being knocked. And I think is another great example of how the focus on feed and traceability and audits help protect our industry from this terrible case. I don't know if you can remember going back to, I think it's 1999. We also have had issues with dioxin in eggs as well, which started in Belgium, and we've had a whole series of dioxin contaminants of eggs and other meat products actually over the years in Europe. And again, we have not been affected in this country because of the standards and audits and the approach that's been taken by British Lion. We have had salmonella outbreaks. They continue to happen. And these are largely eggs that are not produced under the Lion Code. Obviously, the line code's only looking at hen eggs, and so we have eggs coming from ducks or quails now, or backyard eggs where people are selling eggs from their yard, or indeed eggs that have been imported from Europe. And quite a few eggs are still imported from Europe, and a lot of these have been implicated in where eggs have been affected. So I say the recent issues are, we did have a UK outbreak in 2019, and the action that was taken immediately was all flocks were suspended, all eggs were quarantined, because we had a traceability system, so we knew which eggs and flocks were affected. And then the measures were taken to improve controls and testing and sampling. So this scheme is quite a robust one and has demonstrably shown that Salmonella can be controlled in eggs if there is a commitment from the industry. And we have chemical contamination, which, as we said about the fipronil, caused a huge problem in 2017. And our industry, although it was affected with imported eggs, managed not to have any problems. A lot of eggs actually aren't sold on shelf. As you can imagine, a quarter of the eggs that we use in this country are actually processed and used elsewhere, whether it might be in a quiche, people making quiches, or whether there's somebody in industry making ice cream. And so not all pasture eggs are the same as well. But if you have a high bacterial loading, Salmonella might even survive pasteurization. So in the egg, when we talk about eggs, yes, you've got to make sure that they're Salmonella free, but as important, and I think our egg products, where this egg is going to be used elsewhere, you've got to make sure that you have egg-free Salmonella, eggs that are free from Salmonella in those processes as well. The code of practice for production of line eggs is really, really comprehensive. It does make a good read when you compare it to legislation and guidance from the FAO and places like that. It has 700 audible criteria and something like 80 critical things that if you fail on could actually have your mark suspended. So it is comprehensive, and it does do the job, and it starts with the actual breeding of the eggs, of the chickens that are going to be used for the laying of eggs. It goes right through to the hatchery, it goes right to rearing pullets, it goes through to the standards on the farm, it goes through to the packing houses, and it goes through to processing as well. So it covers the complete supply chain for the egg, and I think that's one of its strengths. I'll flick through the video because I think we're going to be pushed for time, and I know the questions are probably the most important part of this. So you should be, when you're looking at your food safety management systems, which are all based upon the general HACCP principles, and as you know, they're laid out in Article 5. When you're looking at hazards and Salmonella hazards, you've identified Salmonella as a hazard. And when you look at your control point, well, one of the control points surely should be the use of line eggs, just for the fact that they are Salmonella free, and they could be used even for raw or lightly cooked foods. And then if you don't have line eggs for some reason, then you've got to relook at your controls. Isn't it about cooking thoroughly to 75? Make sure you're using reputable sources, make sure your traceability is good, looking at cross-contamination during preparation and storage. So simply changing to a non-line egg does bring some extra complication to your HACCP process. And as I say, it's not just on microbiological contamination. We've seen with dioxin, we've seen with fipronil, how important it is to protect against the hazard of chemical contamination as well. And line eggs give you that type of confidence, and certainly if you weren't using line eggs, I don't know of any control that you could really use on chemical contamination unless you've got a massive testing program, which would be very expensive, might even give you a false sense of security. Perhaps we could look at the FHRS, Food Hygiene Rating Scheme. So if you are in catering, if you're in food service, the scheme is really important to us. It's now started up again post-pandemic, and it does give consumers confidence about standards in retail and catering premises. And it's a point-based scheme. And the ratings are related to the standards, and each standard is given a score. And so we know that 5 means that you're meeting the regulations, and everything else is that you're on the process of meeting regulations. So really, 5 is a rating that says you've met the regulations, and everything else is encouraging you to improve. A great scheme, great information for consumers, and I think has been a major way of us improving food safety in catering in this country. So you know, in practice, what's it mean is that businesses can demonstrate appreciation of controls of the hazards. That's so important. And if you can't do that, you could end up with a poor score of 2. So you might be one of the best restaurants in the world, and you might be one of the cleanest restaurants in the world, and you might have one of the best trained staff in the world. But if you can't demonstrate you understand the hazard, then it will affect your score. It's a key thing. Certainly as an EHO, when I give advice, it's a key thing for people to have that knowledge and capability. And there are examples how eggs could influence your FHRS. If you're an environmental health officer and you're going in and you're thinking about microbiological controls, you can look at, if you didn't have British Lion eggs, then you start asking lots of questions about, well, how have you got confidence in those eggs? What's your traceability? You could have vulnerable groups coming into your restaurant. Not all these vulnerable groups are obvious. And if somebody asks for a runny egg and you give them a runny egg and it's not guaranteed salmonella free, again, you're increasing the risk, and you might be introducing a significant hazard and not really understanding that you're doing it. So again, it has an influence on your scoring system, and it's demonstrably showing that you understand how to control hazards. But things do go wrong. It's terrible. Salmonella is a disease, as I've said. I've seen it in a number of people when I was in public health. It is an awful disease. And we've seen where people have used duck eggs because the scheme doesn't cover ducks. So somebody might have a duck egg. And again, you don't know the conditions it's been kept in. You don't know the traceability. In the village that I live in, there is a kind of duck eggs being sold at the back gates of houses where people are selling their produce. And although they're great products, undoubtedly, and reared in great conditions, the question mark in my mind is every time I go past and say, oh, I'd love one of those duck eggs, is how do I know that it's salmonella free? And of course you can't, because there's no system or scheme that it's gone through that is guaranteed for it to be salmonella free. And there is that raw egg challenge always. And I can't emphasize enough, as the IFST do, that if you're part of one of those vulnerable groups, then you've really got to make sure that you're using the lion egg. It gives you so much confidence. And in fact, there is a problem at the moment, is because the scheme's been so successful and people think now all eggs are actually salmonella free. That's not the case, and there might be confusion against some vulnerable groups thinking, well, now it's safe for me to eat eggs runny, and really they'll think it covers all eggs, whereas, as I say, it's only the British Lion egg that gives you that confidence. So there is some research looking into, do vulnerable groups actually know which eggs are covered? We've seen kind of COVID-19 have a huge impact on eggs in this country. Certainly sales have gone down as a consequence, but the British Lion scheme has been solid. It's still making sure that all eggs are maintained to the same standard. That's one of the great things I'm very proud of the industry for, is maintaining that standard. Food fraud, just to finish up on provenance. You know how provenance is so important to consumers. 67% of eggs which are sold through retailers are free range. And that has been growing year on year and year on year. And I think that shows the importance that the public put on the provenance on their eggs. So you've got to make sure that the eggs are what you're buying. And I say that's, again, one of the benefits of the British Lion system. What you do find, and I've seen it myself online during the COVID crisis, lots of eggs being imported. And when you look at them, you're trying to buy them online in a marketplace. It's not always obvious where they come from, except they don't have the line mark on them. And you can get people changing boxes, putting other eggs in there. And we've had cases of people trying to sell eggs which are kind of not free range as free range. as you can imagine, the markup is huge on that, and that's where criminals and gangs get involved. And we've even had cases of contaminated eggs being sold as fit for purpose. So fraudsters will find ways of exploiting industries where there is a markup. So the traceability system is a great way of fighting fraud and making sure that you've got some confidence in the egg that you're buying. So as I come to the end, I'm really looking forward to your questions. Salmonella is a terrible illness. It has an impact globally. And I think if I was to give anyone advice is, look, the first line of defense globally is you always say, eat eggs that are guaranteed salmonella free. That's obviously the first thing you do. And there are some other countries that have schemes, but the vast majority of the globe, the vast majority of the world's population doesn't have that luxury. They're having to use other ways to try to reduce the risk of, salmonella, like really thoroughly cooking the food. And there are lots of sources of salmonella, of course, not just including eggs. And I think we should be proud as an industry. The egg production in the UK has been turned around due to this stringent safety standard. And for me, when I'm talking about crisis management, the use of good science, commitment from industries, commitment from scientists, from operations, from marketing people, I always use and have always used the British line scheme as an example how you can go from a disastrous situation, there's no other word for it, into a situation now where we've actually got one of the best systems in the world, as recognized by a lot of national regulators. And a great reflection of this is government advisors now endorse consumption of runny eggs, even for vulnerable groups, as long as they have the line. So that's my presentation. Happy to take questions. We're very fortunate to have Kevin here, who actually joined the egg industry just as the line mark has come out. So it's had over 20 years experience of dealing with this. And happy to take any questions that I can. Over to you, Jude. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sterling, for such an interesting and engaging presentation. It's certainly been fascinating and a reminder of the great strides that we have made in the egg industry in this country. But also, I found it quite concerning to know that there are still deaths linked to salmonella, both in this country and overseas, and that not every country has adopted our approach and learned from our great line scheme that we do have. So that's been quite interesting. So now we're going to move on to today's Q&A session, where we're joined by Kevin Coles, who's the Trade Director at the British Egg Information Service. So welcome, Kevin, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Morning, no problem.
Just a reminder, you can submit questions using the Q&A function, which will be at the bottom of your screen. All you need to do is hover over that screen if you're using a mouse, and then enter your question or vote for other people's questions. We have got some great ones that have come through, so thank you very much, but please do keep those coming through as well. One of the things that I'd also like to know is, where have all the white eggs gone recently? We seem to now only have brown eggs on the market. What is the difference between white and brown eggs, and where are they? Where are the white eggs nowadays?
So there isn't any difference between a white and a brown egg other than the breed of the hen. So it's the hen that breeds it, which dictates the color of the egg. Where have they gone? We do see in the UK quite a number of white eggs, but they tend to be used more in food service than they do in retail. What we've seen over the past year or 18 months or so is more of those eggs move into retail because food service has been largely closed. And there's been a huge growth in eggs in retail. So what we've seen is a lot of the eggs, perhaps, I mean, McDonald's, for example, uses white eggs. So some of those eggs have then been redeployed into retail. So over the past year, you've seen quite a lot of white eggs in retail. So they've not gone away. I mean, if you go to some other countries, you go to the US, theirs is a white egg market. Ours is a brown egg market, and the reason it's a brown egg market is because in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, consumers thought that brown eggs were a little bit more natural. They were more natural, they were healthier. I mean, there's no scientific reason for that. It's just a personal choice, and therefore the industry moved to brown eggs.
And there's no difference in quality and safety, is there, as well?
None at all.
There is a perception that brown eggs are somehow more nutritious or they're safer. And in fact, it depends on the breed of bird, doesn't it, as to the colour of the egg. So it's very difficult to differentiate between the two scientifically if you compare and contrast.
Exactly that. The only difference, I guess, would be white eggs come from more docile birds. So there are arguments there that actually white eggs, there's less need for things like beak trimming on white birds. But yeah, as I said, it's a choice that consumers make rather than industry. If consumers want white eggs, we'll give them. And we are seeing more white eggs now, and I think we might continue to see that as people get more used to white eggs being on the market.
So one of the questions that we've had in today, if 90% of chicken eggs produced in the UK are under the British Lion scheme, what is the reason for the 10% not being part of that scheme? Is there a cost involved, and should British Lion eggs become a legal requirement?
We've never been a legal requirement, the Lion scheme. It's always been a voluntary scheme led by the industry. We think that's the right way to go. We don't think that we need legislation. I think under the scheme, we work very quickly if there are problems. For example, I mean, that's one of the great things. I mean, Sterling talked about fipronil, and obviously in the UK, we can still have problems. But what we can do under the Lion scheme is shut them down really, really quickly, because we have the capability to go to a farm and say, you cannot produce those anymore for the Lion scheme, sorry. And we can do that immediately. We don't actually need a reason for that. The producers know when they sign up that that is part of the agreement. So we can close the food chain down very quickly in terms of those. I mean, fipronil, for example, we have, under the scheme, you have all of these disinfectants and so on that you can use that are registered under the scheme. You can't use anything else outside of it. So theoretically, it wouldn't happen. In terms of the 10%, there tend to be smaller farms, tend to be supplying locally. You know, their standards will vary, and it would then be incumbent on the, if you're a restaurant or something using those eggs, it would be incumbent on you then to find out the standards that are being used on that farm. Whereas under the Lion scheme, we'll give you certain levels of guarantee. So we'll guarantee that we do all of these steps, and as Sterling mentioned, there are 700 auditable points in the code to absolutely cover as best we can and guarantee as best we can that they will be salmonella free. The UK market is we do import in the UK market. We're 89% self-sufficient, so 11% of our egg requirement comes from abroad. That would tend to go up at times where obviously peak demand, so Christmas, but particularly the first quarter of the year where egg sales are at their strongest. Everyone goes on a diet, and eggs are really good for dieters. So in January, sales go through the roof. So we have those. So we get about 10% in. Now, the standards of those will, I pretty much guarantee, not be as high as under the British Lion scheme, and certainly not as comprehensive. And that's what I particularly worry about, those types of eggs. So we get about 2 billion eggs a year imported into the UK. Now, a lot of those will be processed. And again, Sterling talked about processing, but not every egg that goes through a processing that's further processed is actually pasteurized. Some are only heat treated. So if you talk about things like custards and so on, they're actually heat treated rather than pasteurized, so that it doesn't destroy the egg. So, you know, there is a danger there if you're getting it from salmonella infected flock, for example, that you won't then destroy that salmonella that comes out into it. In the UK, if you have a flock that has salmonella, those eggs cannot be used in Lion processors. What we tend to do is export them to the used on the continent, because the domestic usage is banned under the Lion scheme. So the only place that those eggs can go is abroad or destroyed.
And is there anything that's being done globally to try to improve standards in other countries at all?
Yeah, so under the EU legislation, each country has an individual plan to try to minimise salmonella, but the Lion scheme is just so much more comprehensive than any of those individual plans. Now, it has improved levels of salmonella across Europe, across the EU. There's no question about that. But they're still a million miles away from where we are.
Thank you very much.
Right,
Another
Kevin,
question.
there is a cost to the scheme, isn't it? I think that's what one of the part of the
Yeah. I mean, there is. Sorry, yes, there is cost to the scheme. So, in order to pay for all of the auditing, all of the code of practice and the running of the code of practice, there is a cost to that. And that is a levy which is put through on each case that goes through a pack extension. And that is 11 pence a case being 360 eggs.
Thank you.
And that's the cost of the scheme.
Thank you. And are there any public plans from non-chicken industry? Because obviously Sterling earlier mentioned about duck eggs that aren't part of the Lion Mark scheme. Is there a plan to develop an equivalent scheme for the other types of poultry that are out there? And if not, why not?
I can't answer that in any detail because obviously I represent the egg industry. But when Sterling talked about duck eggs, there was a paper not so long ago which showed that almost 2% of duck eggs had salmonella in them. So that's a huge number. That brought about the Duck Assurance Scheme, and that's run by the British Poultry Council. I don't know too much about that. Maybe somebody else on the call does, but that is about trying to put some of the measures that we have in the Lion Code into certain other industries. But I don't think it's as comprehensive as, well, it's certainly not as comprehensive as the Lion scheme. But they obviously needed to do something, and it's the same. As Sterling showed a chart which showed egg sales in the UK dropping like a stone in the late 80s and early 90s. And the reason for that was because we were making people sick. You know, the industry recognised that it had to do something about that, and that's where the Lion scheme came from. So there was some self-interest in it, and what that has done is completely turned the market around. And now, you know, egg sales are healthy, very healthy. In fact, they're growing year on year on year for the last 14 years. They've been growing at substantial rates.
Okay, thank you very much. And with regards to lightly cooking eggs, how does the Lion Mark scheme protect against other zoonotic pathogens, E. coli, for example?
So E. coli is not really associated, nor Campylobacter associated with eggs. And Sterling's a scientist, so I might let him answer this one. But the main problem that we have is Salmonella enteritidis, and that being PT4. We do have concerns about Salmonella typhimurium, which is why the vaccine was changed a few years ago to incorporate typhimurium as well. But those others, you know, they're not really associated with eggs themselves. Campylobacter is obviously associated with chicken, but one of my friends on our technical committee suggests that is because of the speed of growth of chickens, that they aren't able to grow out of Campylobacter, which might happen over time. And of course, hens are always older. Anything to add to that, Sterling?
Oh, I thought that's a perfect answer. As I say, when you look at Campylobacter, it is associated more with chickens and cross-contamination when you bring the chicken into the home, although you can cook a chicken and get rid of Campylobacter. No, I haven't seen many cases. Actually, Salmonella globally that has been associated with eggs as a microbiological hazard, and not necessarily any others that I've seen.
No. Not to my knowledge, anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you. And got a question here linked into your earlier comment, Kevin, about the Salmonella plans across the EU. So how variable is the quality of the EU member state Salmonella plans, and which elements do you think are particularly good or bad?
That's a very difficult question because they're all very different in terms of their approach. They have to each have an individual plan. So that would be 20, well, it was 28, now 27 different plans across the EU. They will all have individual targets. Now, we started from a much lower base than any of those anyway. And we still have, through the Lion scheme, specific targets about lowering it. And this is for on-farm salmonella. So where it's measured is on-farm. So it's in the environment. That doesn't necessarily mean it's in the egg, but in the environment. And the EFSA does a report of that. Sterling alluded to it. Which measures those. So some of those countries back when this started were at 90% around that figure in terms of on-farm salmonella. That, as I've said, has come down over time, but still any commercial country commercially producing hens' eggs is far higher than what it is in the UK, but they will all have different things, and you know, we still get problems. I mean, there's one in Denmark this morning, which has come around, so with Danish eggs being recalled due to salmonella. So you know, Denmark's is a very good country in terms of production, but they have recalled them all from Germany. So it happens, but I can't really talk about each individual one because they will all be quite different.
Yeah, be quite a challenge to do that. Yeah, we've had
a
question
certainly in 15 minutes that we got left. Yeah.
Yes.
I think also, Judy, a crisis can be seen as an opportunity, and the reason that we're so far ahead is we're under so much pressure. I mean, we can't doubt that the industry almost disappeared. It was on its legs, and that was such a motivation to get this thing done. And I think the European countries haven't had those massive, big kind of political issues with consumers, but that certainly was a big driver getting consumer trust back.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, we were kind of the first big food scare. You know, this is before BSE, before any of these things. It was, you know, eggs was the first real food scare, which is why it made so many headlines at the time, I think, you know, and it went on for so long. And when Sterling says Edwina Curry didn't misspoke, yes, she did, but she did highlight what was an obvious problem. Yeah. So, you know, I think the industry recognised that or certainly those more enlightened people in the industry recognised that Edwina had mentioned the problem. If she hadn't overstated and said most, then you know, she probably would have kept her job. But she was highlighting a problem, and what it was is a catalyst. And I speak to Edwina quite regularly, and you know, it was the catalyst for the industry to do something about its problems. And you know, we talk about it as being one of agriculture's success stories because it was absolutely in the doldrums and has turned its fortunes around almost completely. There is no, you know, but we recognised, you know, in 2019 we had an issue. We recognised that we can't be complacent, and following that we introduced a whole new raft of changes to the code of practice, including increased testing, increased washing of trays, increased turnaround sorting. So all of these things increase. So we're still learning, we're still developing, and the code is a living, breathing document, you know. And we brought Sterling on board as much as anything to challenge us, to say you could be doing this better, guys. You know, so you know, that's the sort of thing that he's also there to do. We're paying for his time, not his opinion. So you know, we want him to stand up and challenge us as an industry.
Brilliant, thank you. And have you had any incidents of fraud where the lion stamp has been used on non-lion eggs intentionally and sold?
Yep. Back in 2006, so 15 years ago, we did. Following that, we introduced a new way of working. So any egg which is now sold or intertraded under the lion scheme goes onto a wholesale database. So we know where every single lion egg in the country is. And that was a direct result of a fraud case in 2006. Other countries can't do the same thing because they can't make their members tell them where they're selling eggs, but whereas we can. So we have a little guy who sits in a room and you know, just watches where all of the egg is going. So we can't have the same thing happen again. But so yeah, that was a direct result in 2006. There have been lots and lots of different things which come out over the years, and you'll see some if you Google them in Germany and other places fairly recently around free range to organic. But we had that problem in 2006, and we stamped on it, and we've introduced this wholesale database, which is aimed at completely alleviating that. You know, in some ways, you'd rather it didn't happen in the first place. But you know, what you've got to do is learn from that and make sure that once it happens, you then have the systems in place so it never happens again. And yes, so that was 15 years ago. We've not had anything since.
Okay, it's reassuring to know that you've got those controls and systems in place. Yeah. Another question here: does the BEIC trace back to the parent farm in the case of vertical or ovarian transfer of Salmonella species?
So we can. The likelihood is that when they come, because they're tested, they won't have salmonella when they get to the farm. It is more likely that the salmonella is endemic, and that's not true in every case, because the breeding flock is the thing we keep the strongest eye on, absolutely testing to heaven and earth. But the chances are that they will get to the flock. They won't be salmonella positive. It will be introduced at some stage during that journey, and the biggest risks are clearly rodents, wild birds, that sort of thing. And if you don't get rid of salmonella properly during clean around or turnaround, then again it's the devil's own job to get rid of salmonella. So it's something one of the biggest things actually which helped the industry was the end of cages, or battery cages, in 2012. Because it meant that we got rid of all of these old systems, completely destroyed them, and had to build new units. I see this question here on about free range, about cage free, and I'll come on to that in a second because it's sort of related. But we had to destroy all of those units and then build new ones, which actually then managed to get rid of a lot of the salmonella which was endemic in those in 2012. So just got rid of them. In terms of cage free is not a legal requirement. It may well become so, but it is not a legal requirement. It was one which has kind of been introduced by the retailers. 2025 is the date that most retailers are working towards, or those that aren't. So M&S, Waitrose, Sainsbury's are already free range. The others are working towards 2025 in terms of that date. The industry will react to customer demand, so we will meet those deadlines. At the moment, we're working through, because we need, obviously it's expensive for us to build huge barns, so we need retailers' commitment about how they want to go, and that's particularly on products. So, for example, the stuff that Sterling talked about that goes into quiches, we need retailers to commit on that as well as on shell eggs, because otherwise the market will just be distorted and we won't be able to service it. So those are the conversations which are going on at the moment. But we made our 2012 deadline, which was the end of battery cages, and we will do the same if that's what consumers want.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got a question from one of the auditors of the Lion Code scheme, saying, as one of the auditors against the Lion Code, do you believe it would be beneficial to increase the number of unannounced audits in line with APHA inspections to further strengthen the code and confidence in the requirements?
Well, unannounced audits have always been a big part of the code. The auditing is now more. I mean, the auditor can probably answer this because he's the auditor. But the auditing is now done on a risk-based level. So it is more about where actually we see maybe particular problems, or if a farmer's failed or so on, then they will then be audited more often than somebody which is a very good farm. Which I think is a good way to go about things. Should more unannounced audits? The problem is if an auditor turns up and they're unannounced and there's nobody there, particularly on a farm, then it becomes problematic, because we're paying for people just to visit farms and not then do a full audit. So what we tend to do is, as I'm sure the auditor will come back, is to talk about audit ready audits, so that they get a call before and then they go on to it. If we see problem farms, I see no reason why we wouldn't increase the number of unannounced audits. Yeah, I mean, if we suspect problems, then unannounced audits is probably the best way to go around those farms.
And the audits are intelligence-led as well, aren't they, Kevin? The fact that there's such a heavy testing regime as well. So we start to see concerns in testing, that will increase the frequency of audits or might spark off an audit. Yeah,
indeed, yeah.
So actually using that data constructively to focus on those hotspots and potential areas.
That's right, and it's in our interest to make sure the scheme is as robust as it can be. Now, we still have to be commercial, because we need to be able to sell our eggs, and we need to not be uncompetitive with Europe. And lion eggs will be more expensive because there is a lot more that goes into the food safety aspects of lion eggs. So we have to bear that in mind, and there is a balance between commerciality, but food safety comes first. Absolutely, every time.
Another question here. Do you think the UK will move to more medium mixed sized eggs rather than large due to media reports earlier on in the year that it could cause health issues for chickens?
See, this is something which the industry is absolutely concerned about, because we would rather people bought more medium eggs because there are more medium eggs available. So we would rather they did it. Consumers think they're getting better value out of a large egg than they are out of a medium egg, which isn't true. If you buy a mixed weight pack, you'll get the best value out of that. So that's a consumer value thing. But the best way to solve that is to put the price up of large eggs, and then immediately you'll separate them and you'll sell more mediums. But that's something that the retailers will be in charge of pricing on shelf. We tend to try to not put sizes on the stuff that we do from a marketing point of view, just because consumers can then choose, and we're not guiding them in one direction or another. We haven't seen any changes from that spate of media stuff that was the last couple of years has been going on for. But from an industry point of view, just commercially, it's better for us to sell more medium.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, that we're running out of time now, so thank you everybody for all of your questions. There are some that we haven't been able to answer, but if we didn't manage, please feel free to contact our speakers directly. Their details will appear on the screen shortly. But first of all, thank you very much, Sterling and Kevin, for your time today, and also for your valid contributions and for answering so many questions. Just to make you aware, as Sterling mentioned earlier, there are details about Sterling's presentation and key elements covered in the December IFST journal, which can be found in the link on the IFST website. We will also share a recording of the webinar, including the Q&A session, to everyone that attended today via email. So you will get a copy of that, and also you can see it on the online webinar hub at www.ifst.org/webinars. Before you log off, please feel free to fill in our short survey, which we will launch after the webinar ends. And thank you again to Kevin and Sterling, and to everybody today who attended, and for all of your valid and great questions that you sent through. It is very much appreciated. These sessions don't work well unless we get that audience contribution, so please do continue to do that in future webinars that we run. Okay, so thank you all very much, and thank you, and I will say goodbye now. So thank you very much.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.